why these books are important to you.
I think there's so much talent in the region, and a lot of it is not celebrated, and everyone looks to Melbourne and Sydney and all the metro areas to find particularly great writers, and there's so many here, and I think that it's really important to share their work and to celebrate them. So any opportunity is a good one.
You went to a local artist again for the cover, which I'm always delighted with your books that you use the local talent. Tell us about the cover.
So Lauren Starr is, for those who haven't seen it, everyone should have their copies, all of the contributors now. Lauren Starr is a local fine artist and photographer, and she takes beautiful photos, but then she takes those images and creates almost like a painting with them and turns them into something incredibly romantic and quite magical. And this is another local girl on the cover page, and she very generously was let us use the image that was created for the cover, and it's just a perfect fit. It says so much, and it's one of those images that the more you look at it, the more you see. And I think Lauren doesn't realise how incredible she is at what she does. So it's really great to be able to share her work with everybody as well.
Ain't it always the case that the best people are the ones who don't notice? I think it's Faye we keep coming back to. Faye probably thinks, why do they keep showing me on the screen? It's because it picks up the noise, Faye, but it picks up sound and then swaps to the person with the sound. But nevertheless, it's probably a good thing, Rodney, that we actually keep going to Faye, because in fact we start the book with Faye, and I wanted to do that partly because it is our way of acknowledging the Dja Dja Wurrung people, the first mothers, I guess, of our region, and Rodney's story therefore starts the collection. Thank you, Faye, for joining us, and it's the most astonishingly moving moment for the book, a very good way to start. You talk, Rodney, about Faye making sure that the language of Dja Dja Wurrung people doesn't get lost. How's it going?
Slowly is a way to explain it, but it's consistent, it's improving. In terms of language reclamation, the difficulty is to have your first language spoken as a second language. The pronunciation of words is really important in any language and communication. Sound as a word can mean so many different things to different people and their languages, but it's improving. Language.
Oh, is it written? Do you have much written record now?
We're very technical, academic about the collection and increasing a language list, a database of language, to be applied to speaking conversation.
Rodney, you talk with such pride about your mum. You really set that going. And Faye, you sound like just has had the most extraordinary life. Can we ask Faye, was he a good boy?
Oh, on and off. But in the main, yeah, in the main. And of course he was very much loved.
Indeed. Yeah. And he shows that in the story. Faye, have you read the story?
I haven't read the whole
the book
story. I have read some of it, which I've now forgotten. But I'm looking forward to not just reading my story, but reading everybody's story. Rodney's already told me how interesting and everybody's story is, and how they're all different, but yet they're all different, but yet they're the same. So it's I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I think congratulations to you. I think it's a wonderful idea. Yeah.
Brilliant, Faye. Thank you. That really sets us going very well indeed. And you're quite right. I don't think Amy or I realised what we were getting into, and what came out of it. Elizabeth Beck, Your mum was born in 1913, so your story very much covers the 20th century, really. What's the, and like many people here today speaking to us, the qualities that you most remember and admire of your mother, you write about that. What was that quality that you remember of your mum?
Oh, that's a hard one, because she was born at the beginning sort of World War One and had that through her early childhood, then through the Depression, and then World War Two. So I'm reflecting on it quite a bit through this coronavirus period, where people are doing things tough, and I think about how tough it was for my mother's childhood and then early years, and then when she was married and with young children with war years again. And they were tough years and years of deprivation, but she always made the most of everything. She was a fantastic manager and provider and organizer, and she never put anybody down. She was a great person to always lend a hand, help out. Yeah, she's very, very empathetic of circumstances. And perhaps that's what's coming through a lot through these particular times, because I think the other side of this coronavirus is going to be a lot of economic hardship for a long time. And I think Mum made us appreciate and value what we had, and things, those shadows that were over us. And again, those big bushfires of 1939, that also had an impact on her. So these were the things she sort of instilled on us, that people could have hard times through no fault of their own, and to care for others, think about walking in their shoes. Yeah.
Exactly. That's really
came through.
Absolutely, and that's very interesting, I think, Elizabeth, that you've talked about us returning to that hard work and austerity. And we're not going to, really, are we? But on the other hand, to remember, and I think Dawn Rasmussen, who's not with us, but I think her story too tells us about the austerity, you know, the extraordinary just acceptance of hardship. Joan, in your Joan O'Brien writes poems about her mum, a couple of poems, and they're very enigmatic. They're very much, what if I'd asked these questions? Why didn't I ask these questions? Elizabeth tells us about her mum's life, but in Joan's poems, it's more, I didn't know about Mum. Why don't we ask questions, Joan?
Well, I don't have any excuse because my mum is still alive. But I think there are things that run through families that are just never talked about, and you just kind of accept that that's the way it is, and no one wants to rock the boat or upset anybody. And so sometimes you think it's easier not to ask and not to know, but you're missing out on such a great wealth of information and experience by not asking.
Do you think you've changed now? Do you think you will ask some questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think it changed when I became a mother, and I had a whole new experience of what that meant, and that sense of being lost as a person and just becoming a mother, and so really wanting to know who she is rather than just someone who's my mum.
Could I ask why you chose the poetry, the poetic form?
I don't know. I think it just it's a more natural fit for my writing.
Yeah. So it fitted the way you like to write. Did you find it difficult though to go to the personal?
Yes, but I think it was important to do, and it's part of that exploration of me as a mum, and then how I relate to my mother as part of that.
Yeah, indeed. I think a lot of the writing, it's a matter of people finding the right form to find the ideas that came to them when they thought, I can write about this. I can write about my mum. True Dowling's a poet as well. I've got to go along the list and find, there she is up the top there. True's form applied something True's been doing. She's very experienced as a poet, but sometimes the rawness of things can become really difficult. True, did you find it difficult to write a series of poems that really covers the life of your mother and some pretty tough stuff in there? Do you find it hard to express in poetry?
I think it's absolutely difficult to write about, particularly since it's only been 6 months or 6 to 8 months since I lost my mum. But I think it's necessary to put it into poetry because poetry is a language of intimacy, and for me, it's my first language when I'm writing about someone, especially someone I'm so close to, but also had a bit of distance with throughout my life as well. I think there's that real, paradoxical relationship that can be so complex with our mothers. And some of the stuff that Mum went through throughout her life, I mean, some of the poems within the sequence that I submitted for this were poems that I'd written years ago. And about half of them, probably about 4 or 5 were ones that I created for this this submission and this project. But with Mum, I think what she's been through was like, who was it? Joan, like Joan just spoke about too. It was more never spoken about. It was never spoken about except with my father expressing what he knew Mum had gone through before I was even born, like when my older siblings were children, and even before they came along. When they were first married, he had to deal with, well, he wanted to be there, obviously, for his wife. They were married for nearly 60 years before they both passed away last year. And I think it helped him to augment and find names for what his wife went through and the difficulties that they went through together as a couple. And I think it brought them stronger and made them closer and stronger with each other as a relationship. And even though we were protected as children, we were still able to hear those stories and to voice those stories. I found it really difficult actually to voice that story. And as you well know, Rosemary, I sort of struggled with whether I even put my name to the poems as well, because I've always said I teach, direct students creative writing, and I've always said if you write it down, it makes it real. So it's really sort of not just being witness, but giving a voice to that experience and those experiences. My own experiences as well with Mum growing up. So, yeah.
I think that was really interesting what you've said there about the changing nature of up and down. When we move away from our mothers, we come back, like anybody in our lives, really. But it's always there. I think one of them, Shan, I think you started by your story by sort of saying mothers are it's a very special relationship. We're going to go to Ben too in a minute, a rather different relationship, but maybe I'll come back to you, Shan, in a tick, because I want to talk to through the book Jacqueline Sheridan, Jackie, if I may call you Jackie.
Sure.
Your story will touch many people because I think the thing about not being somewhere when you want to be, and it comes back to what True was saying, I think that will touch a lot of people. The moment, how did did it help you to come to terms with not being there at the end by writing it down?
Yeah, I think it did. I think, it was quite a process over a period of time to come to terms with it, and yet in some ways the cycle happened very quickly and then it happened very broadly. So as I guess I in the story, that sense of over that 24-hour period wrestling with the, you know, just the disbelieving reality of the fact that it happened and it was never supposed to be that way, through to some kind of deeper reconciliation with it. But then, you know, that's ebbed and flowed since, and I still dip in and out of both of those spaces and stages. There's still times when it feels impossible to think that it happened, that I wasn't there, and at other times there's a deep, profound sense that I was where I needed to be, and I was with her in the sense that, in a manner in which that she and I had shared during life, which was not always in body. But I think for me, it's just they're both always going to be true. It's always going to be the worst thing to have missed it, and the most precious thing to have had what I had.
I was really impressed by your willingness to try to say things which are quite difficult to speak. They're those feelings of spirituality, of you know, otherness, things that we never really catch hold of and understand. Jackie, do you write a lot like that?
I do. I live a lot like that, so therefore I write a lot like that. I guess it's you know, my way of being in the world, and it was Mum's way of being in the world too. That's part of our bond. It was part of our connection. I think just to, you know, to be aware of the mystery, the mystical, the otherness, the way in which we're connected to something so much bigger and broader through so many ways. So it's how it's how I have held myself in the world and how I feel held by the world. So yes, it's a natural way of it then coming through in my writing. It's my primary wrestle, I think, with you know, being human and being part of a very manifest world, but also being part of something so much more. And so that's been vital for me in how I've experienced it and how I've written it. Yeah,
it's a form of religious writing, really, isn't it, Jackie? It's a form of religion.
By religion, but yeah, I mean, it's the numinous, it's the sacred.
That's it. The opening up of language to something that is rather different. We're going back to Rodney Carter and the importance of the language, you know, being held, because Rodney, the things that are said in your language are probably things that aren't necessarily said in the English language, the written language. Maybe if we find a way, you know, if we find a way in through language, we can understand the spirituality of the Dja Dja Wurrung people.
Yeah, if I could take a very broad brush and be reflective of the stories, communication is interesting in that there's the sender of a message, how the receiver comprehends and understands is so varied and unique to the individual. First Peoples languages, and there's many around the world, and Dja Dja Wurrung is not dissimilar. It is actually more to the point. So I think what we've seen through English language and literature is ability to be able to try and craft things beyond the heart and the mind that a lot of other languages don't do, because depending on your social behaviours, and you mightn't be intimate in public because that just needs to be your behaviour, you would think then you communicate more privately and now more intimately in safer surrounds. So
that's very much.
I noticed that was brilliant. I cry a lot, as my mother would know. That helps me healing. I had to put this book down so many times yesterday because I was crying happy and I was crying sad and a whole lot of in between. I really enjoyed it and want to commend everyone.
Oh, thanks, Rodney. That's great. We're going to come to a little bit of food now. It being Mother's Day, I think we should talk about morning tea. Kate Folds actually was one of the people who sort of distanced a little bit from the personal by sort of making story that that had a character which could have been Kate, might not have been Kate. It could have been her family, it might not have been her family, but it's all about the recipes that come to you, that are passed down to you through the generations. And I'm wondering if, you know, we're ever going to lose those recipes, Kate?
I don't think so. I think it's really important that recipes are part of stories, that they're passed down through the generations, and it can be quite healing, as someone mentioned earlier. So my story was actually inspired. It's fiction format, but it was inspired through this book that I had restored at a beautiful little bookbinders in View Street in Bendigo. And I've already, just during this time of isolation with the coronavirus, we've been cooking some of those recipes. I have been with my daughter. So this recipe book was my Nana Rodda's recipe book from when she actually was, before she was married. So I don't know if you can,
yep.
you can see the...
Yeah, look at that writing. Yeah.
Writing.
Yeah.
Yep. It's actually dated the 18th of the 9th, 1937. And when I first came across it, all the pages were just falling out. There was just an old lacquer band that was perished and snapped over. So I had it restored, and with my daughters, we actually have made some green tomato pickles from the garden, some green tomatoes, and we've made those during these times when we've been having to stay at home more often. And just a couple of days ago, actually, some lovely neighbours just down near the creek at Spring Gully, they have a quince tree, and they left at our door, which was really lovely, a bag of quinces. So I'm actually, haven't done it yet, but they're ready to, I've never made quince jelly, but there is a quince jelly recipe that was my nan's in this book. So we're looking forward to that.
Always wonder what you can do with a quince. It's not an easy thing, a quince, I don't reckon. But we'll go to Shan Lyons now, who's, I thought he'd write all about music, but he kind of writes all about food. Tell us about Pat's Place, Shan.
I suppose it was just a reflective piece through the eyes of my childhood. I had to sort of put myself back into being about a 7 or an 8-year-old, and just my view on growing up, and I suppose my mother and family and what that meant to me. But that was the way that my mother communicated her love for not only us, but for the community in Rushworth, where I grew up, was through food. You know, some people are really overt, I suppose, with the way that they communicate love. Some people, it's really easy to give lots of hugs and tell someone they love them, but sometimes non-verbal communication is the way that some people do it, and that might be through food and offerings of food, and yeah, that's probably more so my family. She was such a big character in the place where you grew up. She was an important woman. Wasn't that many people in the town. There's probably 800 people in the town then, and yeah, and then we moved to a town that had a population of 35. So on swampland, still on Jar Jar Run country, but yeah, it's interesting that everyone knows everyone in those smaller towns. And I suppose being down in Bendigo since '97, you actually find that Bendigo is just an extension of a smaller town, even though it's a city. Everyone gets to know everyone, and there's that 6 degrees of separation. So it's probably more so in the smaller towns, because everyone needs to work together as a community to be able to function and make a society a whole. So, what did Mum say when she discovered you'd written about Pat's Place? I've just sent it in the mail. I haven't actually told her. I'd rather her just get it, and like, I didn't even put a card or anything in. I just wrote on the envelope, check page 101. So, because she'll actually think, why have I got this book and where's it come from? Oh. So, there needs to be an element of surprise. I think the majority of my life is so regimented and predictable, so it doesn't hurt to have some spontaneity occasionally, and I suppose other people in my life get the fruits of that. So Mum gets some spontaneity from reading the book, and she's a huge reader. So that was another thing I remember as a kid, that you know, it wouldn't be uncommon for my mum to be reading sort of 600-page novels a fortnight. So that's all she did, was read books and cook and hit us when we needed to with wooden spoons, etc.
Which was not very often, was it, Shan? Because she was such a good boy.
I'd say probably at least a couple of times a week, but I was a really super quick runner, so I had my my safe space, which was on top of a tank stand. So I just ran out the back door, jumped off the back veranda, and ran up this tank stand. I was untouchable up there. You're not going to get this little lady that's 5'3" climbing a tank stand, or even my dad, who's pretty tall, to come and pull you down. So thank the Lord for a tank stand.
I reckon we've got more stories we're going to come out of this book. I can see where we're just opening doors, we're opening windows now. And talking of food still, Shobi, who I'm sorry, Shobi Owen, your name will be, well, we've all got a couple of names, haven't we, Shobi, through our lives. But yours, my goodness me, your story, it smells fantastic. Your story is really through the sense of smell, I think, your memories.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, well, the story was actually originally a eulogy that I wrote for my grandmother when she passed. And I feel like there were two mothers in my home, my mum and my grandma. She lived with us for pretty much my entire life until I was about 25 when I moved out of home, so we'd come back and visit her. But just like Shan was saying, I think there are things that transcend culture, and food was the way that she showed us love. So essentially the greeting in the morning wasn't "how are you," but it was "saparingalap," means "have you eaten?" So that was just always demonstrated. And, you know, guests who would come, that would just be the language of love. So growing up, I guess, you know, in a fairly whitewashed suburb, as an Indian family, we really stood out. And the things that we were initially a bit ashamed of, we've come to, you know, really be proud of and pass down to our own children.
You also tried, like a number of writers, you're obviously quite experienced with developing your own style, and I'm thinking back to Jackie Sheridan. You worked through that, you used kind of words to prompt your ideas, didn't you? You sort of thought, I'll use a word like turmeric, I'll use a word like other words from your own memory of your grandmother to prompt then a memory. This is not really a question, Shobi, but I'm sure you'll be able to say something about it.
Yeah, I think it was just those words, as we were busy as children growing up in our home, that we heard, you know, being screamed out over, you know, between this banter between my mum and the grandmother figure, just talking about all these spices, and they were just thrown in, I guess, they coloured our lives just like the spices, you know, created the flavours for the food. So I guess there is a lot of nostalgia around these words, and something that I'd love to be able to carry on down to my children as well. And sometimes I will say to my children, "Oh, I've got to go shopping," and my daughter will say, "Oh, all you're going to buy is like cumin and turmeric and coriander." And I'm like, yes, it's been like that in some ways. But yeah, the language, like Rodney was talking about before, that is created in that intimate space in the home, yeah, it's just something that stays with you, I suppose. Yeah.
I think it's great too that that now we know about some of these things ourselves, because when I was a kid, we wouldn't have had any of those spices on the shelf at all. Let's get to the dark moment, Benjamin. Benjamin, I'm really pleased to have this in the collection, because a lot of people will say, "Oh, your mum was fantastic." We'll get to Jenny Mitchell later. My goodness me, what a perfect mother. And I know Jenny will go, "Well, she wasn't that perfect," and then she'll tell us all the wonderful things that she did. But Ben, you've written about this before, so it's not as though it's something you had to tackle first up, and I feel that you're getting more confident talking about it. But basically, you're talking about you and your partner whose mothers were did the thing that none of us can imagine, the rejection of a child, and the rejection of a child because of their ideologies. Really, is that a fair way to sum up the way you talk about your mother?
Yeah, it's certainly in terms of my partner. It's definitely in terms of ideology, and I guess for my mother, in actually backing her partner, her husband, is an ideology in a sense that it's like you stand by your partner regardless. And what I really wanted to give voice to was the fact that sadly there are those parts of our community who are affected so much on a day like today by a difficult relationship with their mother. It's a really painful time, and it's I find it quite difficult in terms of I don't want to mess a day that's about women who've been so amazing in our lives and loving and supportive. And I've had wonderful mother figures, but I do want to honour the people who really find it hard today, and those mothers' relationships are so fraught and complicated.
I think honouring, that's a beautiful way to put it, Benjamin, because you say in your piece, I don't want this to be, to stop the beautiful things that so many people are talking about. I just want to say that, for me, Mother's Day ain't a great time. And I guess because Mother's Day becomes such a cliche, really, it's lovely to break away some of that surface cliche and get back to some of the other things that we can talk about.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, and I really appreciate the opportunity to add this voice, this chapter into the book, amongst such great stories of mothers. No mothers are perfect, but it's just really important for me, and particularly to tell my partner's story about how he was shunned by his mother, and it tears my heart out still 32 years ago that he was rejected, but how it still impacts his life, especially at this time when we're told by media and everything we see at this time of year is about celebrating mother, and to feel that betrayal of your blood turns on you in such a visceral way. It's just thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share Darren's story.
I think it's actually...
Benjamin, I'd like to thank you for sharing your story, because I think it's a very important one, and I think it gives us a lot to reflect on, you telling your story and your partner's story. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Benjamin, and absolutely agree. I think it's astonishing how many people turn to Ben because he's doing a stage show now, aren't you, Benjamin? You're actually turning your story from the book into a stage show, and now a contribution for us. So there's lots of interest.
Yeah, there is. As a transgender man too, one of the first questions that people ask is, how have your family responded? And for me, because of my relationship with my mother, I haven't really been able to discuss being trans with her because there was so much other baggage. But yeah, certainly with trans mansplaining, I'm able to delve into like going in for major surgery and not having my mum there, and wishing my mum, a perfect version or a close to perfect version of my mother could have been there to support me during, major life-saving surgery, and not having that.
It's yeah, that's very sobering, Ben, and very real and very potent. That's what I think Rodney was talking about. He just does time after time in this book. You just think, right, I've got this other view, I've got this other person, I've got this other life. Karen Mills, can I hear you? No, we've got Karen Mills on somewhere, and we can't get the video working. But let's acknowledge that Karen can. Sounds like Karen can hear us. She's with us, and Karen's calls her mother royalty. Really, she writes from a place of absolute adoration of her mother. Very. You know, Ben will say, "My goodness me, that must be a feeling," because Karen Mills is just, you can hear it in her words. She's so in awe of her mother. There's a couple of other people. Jenny Mitchell, tell us about your amazing mother, Jenny. She's again, you wrote a eulogy. It's a very upbeat eulogy. It's a very positive. It's full of positive things. Tell us about your mum.
Yes, well, I suppose it was an upbeat eulogy because my mum was, well, not necessarily upbeat, but she was she was quite a funny person and a very playful person. So, and quite irreverent. So it would not have been, she wouldn't have wanted us to all kind of stand around her coffin bemoaning and revering her. She didn't need to be revered. She was an adventurous woman, although I think even as a child she was pretty adventurous, but that was kind of forced on her by my father being sent off to Borneo for his first job. So, and they lived in Adelaide, which was a fairly conservative kind of city back then, maybe even now, I'm not sure. But so it was so amazing that this young woman was going off to Borneo in 1948 that it was written up in the paper. So, you know, there was a sort of a claim to fame. Anyway, off she went. She had no idea what she was going to really. But, you know, she made a go of it. And then I think my dad, when he wrote about Mum, he said she set up 19 different homes in their, you know, during their married life. So I guess there was a resilience there and a willingness to, you know, do it all again, pack up and go somewhere else. So that was, yeah, I guess for me that produced in me a level of willingness and ability to move on, to travel. I remember Mum saying to me, and this was where she perhaps wasn't perfect, when she said to me, you know, you left for university without a backward glance. And I thought, well, yeah, you went to Borneo without a backward glance. Why, you know, why would I not be the daughter that really you brought me up to be? So, yeah, but she was great. I really enjoyed her. She wasn't perfect, as you said before, but she was pretty good.
So do you think she really did have a tinge of recrimination in that you went to uni without? Because somebody else wrote about the going off to uni. I can't remember who it was.
Look, I think she did, in the sense that once we left home, she was a bit lonely. You know, so it was more about that. Both my parents were serious introverts. They were both only children, so we had no family really, no extended family. And the grandparents lived in Adelaide, and their relationships with their parents were a bit fraught. So we did see them a couple of times a year, but it was fraught, you know. So I think family, we were a very nuclear family. We lived in places where we knew nobody, and so that was the four of us. So when I left home as the first daughter, and actually what the issue was I've just remembered the context. At the end of my first year of uni, Dad was sent to South Africa. So Mum, Dad and my sister went to South Africa, but I said, oh no, you know, I've got a life now, I'm staying here. And I think she was kind of hurt by that, or disconcerted, maybe not hurt, but disconcerted, and yeah, just, you know, this daughter that's chosen this new life when we'd always been such a foursome together. So, but not, you know, she never, that was it, like she said it, but it didn't play out any more than that. Yeah.
She goes off to South Africa, says Jenny. Sophie, you're a foursome and you call yourself very ordinary. I'm wondering what you think about that. But you make the ordinary in your family sound absolutely extraordinary.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's I've got 3 sisters and mum and dad, and our life is nothing unusual, I suppose, to what a lot of people's are. But I'm really interested in that idea that the small moments in life can be really joyful, and finding a lot of joy in those small moments. And I think that I am that way now because of the way that we grew up, and it's those little things that probably were just not anything too important or special for mum that really made an impact on me as a child. But yeah, we've had not an unusual life, an ordinary one, but wonderfully ordinary, and just couldn't have asked for a better childhood and a better mum to grow up with. She's just pretty special.
You talk about her having things that she gave you, which is very valuable. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so mum's a big reader, and she knew how important reading and imagination was to us. So she would always set up little fairy gardens for us, and we'd wake up in the mornings and go out, and there'd be just remnants of a party that the fairies had that night, and we would just be wishing and dreaming for all of the things that would be happening while we were asleep. And it's just little things like that that really sort of took root in our minds, mine and my sisters, that we'd go out to the forest and we'd be hunting for fairies wherever we could find them. And there was just that real just belief in magic and adventure and imagination, I think. Yeah.
Jenny, that speaks to you, doesn't it, the fairy tales?
It does indeed, yes, yes. Mum just, you know, the thing that just words and language, they were just so much part of Mum. She would quote poems and Shakespeare at us all the time. And we also had our own kind of almost like a family language. You know, there were things like the Jabberwocky poem that was just kind of part of our life. So if anybody had a good day, it was always a frabjous day. And then the whole sort of back more to the fairy tales. She didn't know that she was doing what she was doing, but she just, I guess it came out of her own love of language and literature. So fairy tales, myths, legends, books, they were just always there. And I believed in fairies too. I thought they were very, you know, I'm sure we had them at the bottom of our garden. So.
So much, so often the reading comes through to all of your mother's times. Mothers were great readers. Natalie, your memory of your mother is that your mother, you think she's very old-fashioned. She was very much of her time, but she was very modern too. Tell us why you say that.
Okay, my mum's only 20 years older than me, and I'm the eldest of 3. And I just remember in secondary school, you know, going off to the school social, as they called them in the country, sort of the school dance, and my mum and dad making a really big fuss over a pair of high heels. I mean, they were about like that high. They weren't, you know, they were actually quite modest. I see 10-year-olds getting around in heels that high these days. So as an 18-year-old, I just thought, oh, they're just, you know, some nice new shoes for the school dance. But to mum and dad, it was a really big deal, which was kind of weird. But over the years, I've watched my mum become very modern. She's probably trendier than I am in her tastes in, you know, TV shows and music and stuff like that. But it's been a joy watching her develop as this woman, not my mum in a way. Do you know what I mean? So my small piece in the collection is really a tribute to her, you know, sans mothership, in, you know, sans, you know, motherhood rather. You know, it's really about, you know, she's going to die when she opens up and realises that I've written this about her. So I'm not going to tell her anything. That's in the book. I'm Nat Jane. I do a lot of academic writing, so I've put my creative writing hat on for this collection. So I'm just going to hand her the book, and I'm going to see if she can find me and her in it.
Mm-hmm. There's another one. the world is full of people with several names. We've got several of them in front of you. And Amy Doak and I, Amy, we went through some interesting times, didn't we? Trying to sort out who was who.
Toing and froing, and I'm terrible with spelling people's names the wrong way in the first place, so that was fun.
Actually, just when Natalie came up on the screen just then, I went, oh my goodness, I didn't get her wrong, did I? You frightened me again, even though, and I was telling people at the beginning that that Zoom, and we were going live with Zoom, and I'm hoping it's going out there to Facebook, because Zoom must have been doing something today, and they were upgrading their site, and it just disappeared off the options to actually live stream. And this is why I think perhaps Karen Mills, poor old Karen out there in the ether, sorry about that. But it's back, by the way, people. It's come back. The option to do that live streaming has just popped back up on the screen. As wonderful as it all is, it also sends us crazy. I want to talk to Pam and Deb. I think at the moment they're the only ones I haven't done through, and then we'll come back just to a last comment from each of you. And I'm thinking, Deb, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just hold you, because Pam's story is possibly, for me, the hardest because it's about dementia. It's about losing old people, and this is such a topic, losing them and then finding them again. And Pam, of course, has a health background, so she's brilliant at being able to talk about these things, both personally, but in a way that gives us some strength that so many of us know is ahead of us or is behind us for some people whose parents have suffered from dementia. Pam, you, when you went to write this story, had you written about this before? Was this the first time you talked about your mother's dementia?
Well, that's a funny question, really, because when this the opportunity came up to contribute to this book, I found this old story that I'd started, and I actually started it as more like an academic non-fiction, like a creative writing, to talk about dementia and vascular dementia in particular, because we hear a lot about Alzheimer's, we don't hear a lot about vascular dementia, which has a different trajectory and different journey for everyone. So when I pulled it out, I'd written it as a draft, but my mum was still alive at that point, and she had since died. So I sort of went back and added the journey of her final 12 months, I suppose, and well, what I think was the most beautiful thing was her death, really, because we had this opportunity, my three brothers and I, to sit with her as she declined, and she declined quite rapidly over 3 days. And we had the best time. Like, you know, my brothers are much, much older than me, and I was the little whoopsie on the end, as they constantly tell me, and a very spoilt, you know, female child. So, you know, I just had it all, really. And we hadn't got together like that for decades, I suppose. And we just sat and we read and we talked and we discussed tuna casseroles and dogs that we'd had and, you know, bits and pieces. And finally Mum just sort of went, and we were sitting there going, well, now we're orphans. This is ridiculous. You know, the youngest of us is 50, but we're now orphans. But it was, you know, people talk about perfect deaths, and I think my mum's was. Which is,
that will resonate with you, Jackie.
About it being a perfect death?
Well, no, just the moment, because you weren't there for the moment, but you realised later on that maybe you were there anyway for the moment.
Yeah. It's interesting. It was powerfully both. My brother, the rest of my family were with my mum, and my brother rang and then video called me in, and this strange, weird scenario of kind of seeing her and seeing them together in that moment. So yeah, so a window into being present to the moment, but and yes, present, as you say, in some way.
I think a lot of you have also talked about touching base with siblings, with brothers and sisters through the writing of these stories as well, which is probably something I think Wendy is there with Faye, actually, isn't she, Rodney?
Yes, she is, but you might be on Facebook watching. I don't know what's
going on. Hey, Wendy, did you find Rodney's story opened up things for you?
I haven't actually read the story yet. So
another one. Yeah. Of course. Yes, of course. Isn't this interesting that people, and Shan, you're doing the same thing, not even telling Mum that you've written it, which I find very funny.
Need an element of surprise in life, don't you?
Yes, you do indeed. Let's go to Deb Wayne, because Deb's going to take us out into the garden. Deb's found that she was very different from her mum, but also very similar, and that was because you ended up realising that you had one of the same pleasures, and you think your mum maybe helped you find that pleasure. Tell us about that, Deb.
Oh, I think that perhaps the difference between my mum and myself, I think those differences were things that I was trying to exaggerate. Like, I was a very independent young person, and probably still am. But my mum and I are actually incredibly similar, and we clashed perhaps when I was a teenager because of that. So I liked to think that I wasn't anything like her at all. That's really not true at all. And I think perhaps my story is a little bit about maturity and coming to realise that, you know, I am like my mum, and that's actually a good thing, not a bad thing.
And how much is the gardening, do you think, a thing that brings you together? Because at one stage you realised that it wasn't a passion for the native plants that you shared with her. She's just much more practical.
Yeah, that's right. So it was interesting because I grew up with this amazing native plant garden, which nobody really around me had. No one but my mum and dad's garden was like that. And then when I sort of fell in love with you know, Indigenous species, plant species, I was then found my mum, you know, having much more cottage garden sort of plants or non-native things, and azaleas and rhododendrons, and that was just because that's what suited the new garden that she moved into. But yeah, it's something that we do share. I've done a lot of work in my mum's garden with her, you know, planting things, but also more serious sort of landscape stuff, I suppose. I'm not a particularly good gardener. It's pretty dry out here near Heathcote where I am, and it can be hard to establish a garden. But of course, I've stuck with, you know, the native species, not necessarily, you know, Indigenous to the area, but for my garden at least. But Mum does like to come and see how things are growing, for sure.
It's a great way to have a conversation.
Gardening's ongoing learning.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ongoing learning,
isn't it, Elizabeth? And you can change it all the time, which I find really fascinating as well. And hello, Shobi's daughter. Yours is the next one. You could write about Mum. What would you say about, what's Shobi's daughter's name?
Priya.
Priya?
Priya.
Oh, hey, how you going? What do you think of Mum's story?
Good.
Yeah. Does she cook well?
Yep.
I bet.
She makes very yummy curries. Her father is very good at cooking.
Excellent. Well. Yeah. There's nothing like a good curry, Shobi. You're having a curry today for Mother's Day?
We are actually.
Very good. Poor old Jenny Musty. Looked as though I'd forgotten you, didn't it? You were hiding up there next to me. That was the trouble. Couldn't look at myself. Tell me about your story, Jenny. Tell me about your mother's moment.
Okay, well, it actually happened when we were travelling back to my home a few months after my dad had died. And it was the first time that Mum was going to come up to my home since that event. And there was a moment in that car when we were listening to a song, and it really was quite pivotal. It was like, oh, I'm not sure that I can actually come up. I don't think I'm ready. And she was quite upset, but she still didn't want me to see her crumble. So that moment has always stayed in my mind, because she was very strong and very resilient at that moment. And ever since that time, she has proved to me the same. And she's been an amazing, amazing person, an amazing role model, and showing me her resilience and her strength, even though at that time she just lost her husband, and it was, you know, he was only quite young, and their life was about to start, full of all different things that they were going to do, and it all changed very quickly. So for us, my story started in terms of looking at our relationship over that time and how we've talked to each other via the phone and met each other in the city and made every moment count that we've been spending together. And it's, yes, been a really interesting and beautiful relationship.
I think that's very much touches on what a couple of people said about because your mother went on, has gone on to survive really well. Like she really blossomed probably in ways that she didn't expect to.
Absolutely. She has filled her life with so many wonderful things and so many good people. She's surrounded herself with people that think the same and enjoy the same things, and she draws strength from that. She has a wonderful family, and even through the last few months, through the coronavirus, she's even shown us that even though things can be quiet and different, she's still the same strong person and uplifting us all the time and maintaining, you know, making sure that she's doing things and her day is full. So yeah, it's just amazing.